So I'm so pleased to introduce our presenter, Molly Rose Williams. Molly is an educator, an artist, a writer, an audio producer, and her relationship with the Edible Schoolyard started when she was 11 as a student of King Middle School and has deepened over the years through her time as an Edible Schoolyard garden intern, a cooking teacher, curriculum developer, and teacher trainer. So thanks so much, Molly, for being here, and I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much, Russell. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and happy to see all your faces in your little boxes. So as Russell said, I went to Edible Schoolyard as a middle school student and absolutely fell in love with the place. I spent a lot of time there. And then since then have been working there on and off over the years, first as a volunteer and then a plant sale intern and then a kitchen teacher. And that really got me involved in thinking about curriculum and curriculum development. And for the past 8 years or so, I've been doing that professionally in various capacities. And so today what we're going to talk about is how to integrate academic standards in hands-on cooking and gardening lessons in an engaging way. Before we get started with that, I want to just get a moment to get a sense of where everyone is from. So if you could just write your name in the chat and where you're calling in from, it'd be fun to see that. Okay, we got Berkeley, New Orleans, Hollywood, Ann Arbor, Eureka, Oakland, Scottsdale, Australia, Hawaii, Minnesota, Vermont, New Jersey, Phoenix. What's hot in Phoenix today, I've heard. Portland, Oregon. Okay, so fun. Brazil. Okay, all over the place. This is great. And then what I would also like to see is just holding up, Russell, if you would mind just stopping the screen share for a moment, just to get a sense of like what people's comfort levels are with academic standards. If you could hold up one finger, I'm like not familiar or comfortable at all with designing lessons to academic standards, and 5, I'm super familiar and comfortable with it. Anywhere from 1 to 5. Okay. Okay, great. We have a whole range. Okay, great. Perfect. We're going to be doing stuff that's relevant to everyone today. I just wanted to get a sense of who was in the room. So we can start with the slideshow again now. Great. So today we're going to be focusing mostly on Common Core and next generation science standards. They're not the only standards out there, but those are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. And we're going to start by talking about what are standards and where do they come from? Like, why do they exist? Then we're going to look at some common standards that are used in the kitchen and garden. You can use any standard in the kitchen and garden spaces, but I've found over the years that there are certain ones that are particularly well suited to these spaces. We're going to talk about what it means to meet a standard and have a little bit of practice in a breakout room, talking about Common Core in particular at that time. And then we're going to do a more sort of robust practice of trying to design a standards-based activity, again in breakout rooms, and this time looking more specifically at NGSS. So that is the overview of today. So starting with an intro to standards on the next slide. They were first developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And at the time, the people who developed them were really excited about the idea of having learning that it was basically objective-based learning. So deciding what is it that we want to teach, define that up front, and then be able to design ways of assessing, did we teach that or not? It was a really revolutionary idea when it came around, and a lot of people were super excited about it. And then it kind of just fell off the map. It was like sort of got integrated, but standards as a thing never really got applied on a large scale. And in the 1980s, they kind of came back into fashion as a way to standardize learning across the country. And at this time, it was a more of a political move, where at the time, the administration was thinking, in order for the country to proceed as a world power, it was important to know what people were learning. And it was important to know that people were learning essentially similar things everywhere. as opposed to, kids in Wichita, Kansas, learning completely different things from Ann Arbor, Michigan, from New York City, from LA. So standards came back in the 1980s as a way to standardize learning. And more recently, over time, they've been tied more explicitly to specific pedagogical techniques. So at first, it was really focused on content. What are students learning? And now, especially with Common Core and NGSS, it's focused more on how are students learning? What are best practices? How do we believe that, teaching science is most effective for students to learn it in the way that we think is important for them to understand going forward? So that's kind of where we're at now. Next slide. That being said, standards are always an expression of values. And I'm curious, just take a moment when I say that, like what comes up for you? Just think to yourself, standards are an expression of values. What type of values? What do you think that could mean? There may be a lot of different things coming up for you when you think about that. And I just want to acknowledge, like I always do when we talk about standards, that standards are not neutral. It's not like just some cool thing of saying we think that kids should learn this and then that's where the conversation ends. They are also an expression of value systems. So it says at any given time what the people in power or the people who created it believe is important for kids to learn. And so the reality of it is that many standards today express value systems that have been historically privileged in the Western world. So they exist within and express systems like colonialism, imperialism, racism. All of that is baked into how standards are made. And that's just part of what they are. They also express more progressive movements that have existed in response to those systems. And one thing I also like to remember is that many, many people over many, many years have been working to make standards as good as they can. And pretty much everyone who's ever worked on standards really cares about the educational experience of students. So they're this sort of iterative, complex mix of all kinds of values. I'm going to stop there now, and I want you to either just personally or on paper reflect on, I think it's on the next slide, how would you describe your relationship to standards? And what goals or questions do you have for the workshop today? Take like a minute or two just to think about those questions. I see Debbie says, I'm a willow, not the oak. As the standards change, I change with them and keep my job. This over the past 42 years. Creating lessons first and working backwards to standards last. It's easier that way. My question is how to hate them less. I love that. We're definitely going to talk about that today. I'm one of those rare people that actually I nerd out on standards. I think they're kind of cool. I have to use them. They're a guide for me to let me know that I'm on track, contribute to my feeling of program legitimacy. Yeah, definitely huge for establishing legitimacy. Looking to help teachers use Kitchen and Garden to accomplish subject-specific goals within their framework. Yeah, standards are a massive tool for collaboration. General guide for overall scope and sequence. Yeah, creative constraints. So keep all of these ideas in mind. If you have a specific goal or vision of what you want out of this workshop today, keep that in mind as we go, and see, like at moments there will be times that I check in and make sure that we're hitting that for you. Okay, so in practice, we've kind of alluded to this, but there's a lot of flexibility for how standards alignment can play out. At worst, I would say that standards can limit teachers' capacity to be relevant and responsive. They're sort of like, they can be seen as a rigid framework where you can't actually respond to what the students need in the room. You have to respond to what the state has told you you should teach. They can devalue certain systems of learning and knowledge by omitting them or perpetuating others in harmful ways. They can become a tool for extracting money from school systems. If some, curriculum corporation is deciding to change the standard every couple of years and then selling the same expensive textbook over and over with just small updates. They can set schools up to lose autonomy. They can prompt shame. They can be complicated and make students feel as if their types of value or their types of knowledge are not valuable. All that's true. And at best, I think that standards can offer a foundation for a more equitable education system. It gives us a baseline and helps us understand a place that we can start so that everyone going forward has these quote unquote passports to future opportunities as students. And I would say even more important for what we're doing here today, they can support us as educators in engaging more critically with what and how we teach, both by offering us a sense from the outside of maybe what we could teach if we hadn't thought of it, or by offering something to critically engage with and seeing what parts of this feel really aligned with the way that I want to teach and what parts maybe don't, and how do I use that as a way to learn more about what I want to teach and then teach what I want to teach. So that is what I would say we're going to be focusing more on today. On that note, I want you to take a moment to just reflect on what values feel important to you as an educator. We're going to be designing a standards-based lesson today, and the standards are one form of sort of roadmap for what that activity or lesson should incorporate. And now take a moment, are there any values that you want to make sure that you want to incorporate? Like for me personally, one of my values is having students fully engaged in doing things. That's like one of the most important things for me when I go into a classroom is want to make sure that students are doing stuff. Respect for all living things, care, empathy, understanding. Christian values, community, creativity, and action, physical movement, cooperation. Great. So keep these with you as we're designing this activity today. Studentishness. All right, so our first sort of activity is just going to look a little bit more closely at what does it mean to be standards aligned. But before you can make a standards aligned lesson, you want to know, like, really what does that mean? And so the place we're going to explore that is with 3 Common Core standards that, in my experience, show up in some way in almost every single lesson. So those 3 standards are engaging effectively in a range of collaborative discussions, determining the meaning of words and phrases as they're used in a text, so basically close reading, and then interpret information presented in diverse media and formats and explain how it contributes to a topic, text, or issue under study. You'll note all of these are the 6th grade versions of these standards. But if you look at this standard in sort of any grade range, it's going to be essentially the same, just slightly varied for the age group of the students. But you can see these 3 standards, it's like it actually would be hard in some ways to create a lesson that didn't involve some form of discussion. And so I want you to take a look at these standards now and just think of an example for each standard. What is an example of a lesson or an activity that you teach or have taught that you think probably covers this standard? So when you have some examples in your head, I want you now to, there's like a few questions to sort of really check, is it fully standards aligned? So when I'm trying to check, I have an activity, I'm like, okay, here's an activity that I teach where students are discussing something. To check, is this standards aligned? I'm going to ask, is every student going to have an opportunity to engage in the standards-based learning? Sure, maybe there's a discussion as part of the lesson, but if I'm not sure that every student is going to have an opportunity to engage in that discussion, maybe some students are off doing a different activity at that time, then I wouldn't consider it standards aligned because every student needs the opportunity to engage in the standards-based learning. With discussions, I want to clarify, this doesn't mean that every student needs to speak. That's not what it means to be standards aligned to having a discussion, but every student needs to be there and having the opportunity to engage in the discussion, whether it is speaking or listening. How integrated is the standards-based learning with the primary lesson objectives? Let's say it's a lesson on pH. We're looking at cheese making and thinking about pH and acids and bases. If the discussion is about what is your favorite type of cheese, I wouldn't consider it standards aligned necessarily, because that discussion isn't getting to the heart of what the primary lesson objective is, if the primary lesson objective is about pH and acids and bases. you could make the argument that maybe it is standards aligned, but I wouldn't say that it's robustly standards aligned. So if I want to make sure that it's aligned to a discussion-based lesson, then I would want to make sure that that discussion has to do with how do we, maybe what is the method by which we can tell, is this an acid or a base? And depending on if it's an acid or a base, what are the next steps we're going to take, or something that's directly related to the meat of the content. And then how integrated is the standards-based learning with gardening and or cooking practices? That's a unique question to the types of spaces that we work in. And that's a lesson it's a question I often ask myself when I'm designing lessons. Again, this same example of, we could have a discussion about what's your favorite type of cheese. And, depending on what grade level, maybe that's the more grade levels, like relevant discussion to be having. But I would argue that the most robust standards-based learning, and the standards-based learning that's most exciting to be creating, is when it's directly related to the gardening or cooking practices, as opposed to sort of like add-ons at the end. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take some time in a breakout room, about 10 minutes, and you're going to be paired with 1 or 2 other people. And I want you just to talk through these 3 standards that we already looked at, these Common Core standards, and talk through 1 or 2 examples of a lesson or an activity that you have that is standards-based according to these questions. And if you can't think of an example, then come up, sort of brainstorm one and workshop and see how can you make it more standards aligned. Russell just shared the document in the chat that has sort of the prompt and everything for this breakout room, and he'll put you in breakout rooms. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. So we're going to move on. We'll keep talking about all these ideas, but I want to just make the point that with Common Core, and I think we can start sharing the slideshow again, Russell. With Common Core, it so much comes down to teaching practices. So some examples, I wanted to give some examples for this first standard when we're talking about engaging in a range of collaborative discussions. Some things that we use at Edible Schoolyard all the time are a walk and talk in the garden. So, opening circle, everyone's gathering, we're going to introduce the work for the day and then introduce the main question. Like, maybe we're looking specifically at, what do seeds need in order to survive? And we're going to be doing that by working in the greenhouse and propagating some plant starts. So you pose that question at opening circle, what do seeds need in order to survive? Have students pair up. And as you walk from the opening circle to the greenhouse, you're going to ask students to discuss that question. And then when you get there, have them share out. Again, all of this comes down to just pedagogical technique. It's my teaching practices that determines whether or not that standard's being hit. If I just say talk about this and then there's never a moment where I ask them to share out, I wouldn't consider it standards aligned because there's no check to see whether every student has actually engaged. Instead, I want to create the expectation that everyone will engage in this collaborative discussion by having the share out at the end. And that creates standards alignment. Does that make sense? So similarly, we might have a discussion at the table while eating. There may be a moment where I pose a question of, like what are some of the cross-cutting concepts? We're going to talk about next generation science standards in a moment. So what are some big scientific ideas that you saw at work today while we were making our sauteed greens? Pose that to the table. People can have their discussions. And then again, a share out at the end, make sure that students have had a chance and organize a more formalized moment where we share out what have people been talking about and make sure that there is a more facilitated discussion. It comes down to teaching practices so often when we're talking about Common Core alignment. NGSS is slightly different. It also relies on teaching practices, but it's a little bit more complicated in terms of design. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. So just a little background on NGSS. Every standard has 3 dimensions. Some of this might feel a little bit complicated if this is your first time, and don't worry about it. If it's not your first time, it might feel like review, but we're just going to kind of cover some of the basics. So every standard is going to have a disciplinary core idea. So what's the main idea or concepts that students are meant to understand? It's going to have a science and engineering practice, meaning what are the main skills or practices that students are expected to gain competency in? And it's going to have a cross-cutting concept, which means what connections should students be able to draw between their new learning and big ideas in science. So an example of this is, can you go to the next slide? So here's a standard: analyze and interpret data to provide evidence for the effects of resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms in an ecosystem. So the disciplinary core idea here is, go to the next slide. Resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms. We're looking at how does resource availability affect organisms? That's kind of the main idea or concept. The science and engineering practice is analyzing and interpreting data. That's what we want students to be able to do. So again, science and engineering do analyze and interpret data, be able to talk about disciplinary core idea. And then the cross-cutting concept here, I've identified it as cause and effect. This is the one that's sort of like a little bit more ambiguous often when you're working with a standard. You could see it a few different ways. But for me, the cross-cutting concept here is cause and effect. The cause is resource availability, and the effect is how does that affect organisms and populations of organisms. So once you've identified those three dimensions of a standard, then you can start thinking about how can I design a lesson according to this standard that really hits the standard. And what I would say is that the first thing I usually look at is what is the science and engineering practice, because that tells me what students have to do. So the science and engineering practice right here is analyzing and interpreting data. That means that if I'm designing a lesson that hits this standard, students are going to need some data to analyze and interpret. That's going to be the core activity of the lesson. What is the data about? The data is about the disciplinary core idea. So I need to design a lesson where students are able to analyze and interpret data about resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms. And they're going to need to be able to describe the cause and effect of resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms. Does that make sense? I just broke that down. Are there any big questions around that?
Yeah, why is effects considered a cross-cutting concept?
Good question. So it's kind of shorthand. I think Russell may have shared in the chat. I can share it again right now. The whole list of cross-cutting concepts. There's a bunch of them. If you go to the NGSS website, there are things like patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, stability and change. When I'm designing, I see this as kind of like the party favors. Like a hardcore NGSS person might not like me describing cross-cutting concepts that way, but to me, the critical stuff is the science and engineering practice and the disciplinary core idea. That's the stuff that's kind of non-negotiable, and it's also the stuff that's really clear. The cross-cutting concepts are by nature things that show up everywhere in science. And so depending on how I wanted to structure this lesson, I could kind of choose any of these cross-cutting concepts and make the lesson about that. So let's say I want to analyze and interpret data. Let's say I choose the cross-cutting concept patterns. That would also be applicable in this case. So maybe I would say, okay, I'm going to design a lesson where we're going to plant a whole bunch of carrot starts. Half of these carrot starts, we're going to give compost and extra fertilizer. Half of the carrot starts, we're not. So now we're designing an experiment where there's a different amount of resource availability for populations of organisms. And we're going to ask students to collect data over time How do the carrot starts without the nutrients perform versus the carrot starts with the nutrients? Once they have that data, they're going to analyze it and interpret it. We could say the cross-cutting concept there is patterns. They're looking for patterns in the data. We could say maybe the cross-cutting concept, if you really wanted to like push it, let's say like cause and effect and patterns, I feel like are the two that would most easily lend themselves to that example. Does that make sense though? It's kind of like looking first at the SEP and the DCI and then looking at those cross-cutting concepts and saying which one of these helps students understand the big idea of what's going on here. Okay, great. Let me go to the next slide. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms again, and we're going to share a document with you that has a bunch of common standards, both Common Core and NGSS standards that I've found are particularly well suited for kitchen and garden classrooms. You're going to choose one of the list from the common standards, and then we get to the next slide. You're going to break it down like I just did with what are they going to do? What are the key themes or concepts? And what is the cross-cutting concept? Again, if you're doing Common Core, don't worry about breaking it down this way. This is just for NGSS. After that, you're going to connect it to cooking or gardening. So again, the sort of brainstorm that I would do about the standard that we just looked at is I would think, what are, for example, farming practices that affect resource availability? So with crops, we can think about nutrients, we can think about water, like irrigation practices, we can think about sunlight. Maybe I plant a bunch of starts in shade and I plant a bunch of starts in the sun, see how that affects it. We can also think about access to nutrient or access to resources that pollinators and beneficial insects have. And like practices that affect that are planting flowering perennials. Maybe we're looking at data from a garden where there's no flowering perennials versus a garden where there are flowering perennials and seeing if that affects pollinator populations. Microbes, we're thinking about like, maybe we would look at what does it mean to turn a compost versus not turn a compost, which affects access to oxygen that microbes have. So kind of brainstorming what are practices that relate to this big idea. And then designing an activity. So it's not enough just to say, okay, resource availability, we're thinking about nutrients. Great, students are going to do something about nutrients and plants. Really think, okay, in order to make a controlled experiment, like I pointed out, you know, one group of plants that does have compost, one group of plants without compost, we're probably going to maybe even want a third group of plants with a little bit of compost so that we can see, does a little bit versus a lot make a difference? And then figure out how are you going to actually structure student engagement? You know, at what point are you going to introduce the fact that like they have these different sort of levels of nutrients, and are the students going to do the planting, or will the planting already have been done? What types of data are they going to be collecting? So thinking through how are the students going to be engaging in order to hit the practice that is outlined. So we're going to practice now. Again, going into breakout rooms. And again, I think there was a little bit of an issue last time with you had to like leave the Zoom room, the Zoom session in order to leave your breakout room. Don't worry, we'll let you right back in and then get you into another breakout room that works better. But you're going to be working with a partner. Here's a document that has all the prompts and information for you to chat with. Oh, Russell just shared it. And then we'll get you in breakout rooms in just a moment. I think maybe we're mostly all back at this point. I would love to hear specifically if there were any big questions that came up for you. We're in our last 10 minutes now of the session. And if there's any major questions, or if there was a specific goal that you had in mind coming into this session that you don't feel that you've achieved yet, or a specific question that you wanted answered, This last little bit of time, we're going to have some time for question and answer. And then we're going to ask you to fill out a little feedback survey right at the end. But you can either raise your hand or put in the chat, or if there's just something you talked about in your discussion that you feel really excited about and want to share, we'd love to hear that too. I see in the chat, I heard there's a live training option for this wonderful series. Yes, there is a summer training that Edible Schoolyard offers that is live. Do I have all the standards already unpacked? I don't, but that's actually a great idea. And I'm realizing now that would be an interesting resource. Those standards that are on that worksheet that we just shared with you, that would be an interesting resource to think about developing. So maybe that will be coming out soon. But we don't have that now. Can anyone share ideas for indoor activities that involve food or ingredients, but without real cooking or gardening? Edible food intro. For example, studying fruits anatomy. I know that there's examples of that on the network. And I also, a couple of years ago, created a curriculum for Edible Schoolyard called What's on Your Plate, which was a whole series of lessons around food and eating and nutrition and relationships to food that took place in academic classrooms and involved some small tasting activities, but no full-blown cooking or gardening. We can include that. We're going to follow up after this with resources, and we can include that in the resource list. Any other thoughts or questions? Or particular challenges? This stuff is hard and takes practice. So if there was a specific thing that you were kind of working on and you're like, I don't know if I really got that, now's a good time to just ask and we can talk through it. Okay, so the first two things that come up for me is number one, you're going to want to choose whether you're working with NGSS or Common Core. If you are not trained in science and you're not specifically working with science classes, then I would recommend going Common Core because it's simpler. If you want to collaborate with science teachers, which is awesome, and if any of you have the bandwidth to do it, I highly recommend. Then what I would do first is I would go to the science teacher and I would say, we have these watermelon coming in. What are you going to be studying in the science class at that time? Can we talk together for a moment about how this might relate? Let's assume you're not doing that track. Let's assume you're going to go Common Core, which is a little bit easier, sort of hanging fruit. So then what I would do is I would look at those three standards that I shared. Those, I think there's other Common Core standards, but those to me are the ones that are the easiest that can happen in kind of an instance. And specifically the discussion one is like, you can see that pretty much any time. And so what I would do is I would essentially figure out what is it that you want to do in this watermelon lesson. And then what are moments that you would be wanting students to discuss questions? What are some of the big questions that might be coming up? And then how could you structure those discussions to make sure that every student is participating and that the content of that discussion is directly related to what you're looking at with the watermelons? And that you're making sure that not only is every student participating in the discussion, but then they're going to have a chance to kind of share out and be held accountable for that participation. And that is kind of like the quick and easy, like slap a standard on any lesson fix. All the other stuff you can get much more in depth. And there's, plenty of ways that you could go. But I would say that if you're wanting to just have the lowest barrier to entry, that's usually what I would do, is just take a look at the discussion and then say, how can I make this discussion standards aligned?
Also, plugging interdependence in the garden ecosystem that you wrote, Molly, I put it in the chat. You want to speak to that a little bit?
The NGSS aligned curriculum. Yeah, so that's a curriculum that I worked on the past year, and it's a whole series of lessons around basically one major Next Generation's performance standard around understanding ecosystems and how interdependence works in ecosystems. So all the lessons are garden based. They happen in the garden classroom. And they cover that idea of interdependence in ecosystems from lots of different angles. They include a lot of different gardening tasks and activities. So students are out there weeding and cultivating and composting and planting new plant starts and all kinds of garden activities. But each one of them is set up and framed within the lens of ecosystems and interdependence within ecosystems. And the lesson series builds on itself. So I would highly recommend taking a look at that lesson series. Even if you don't teach it, it might be a helpful example for how this can look in a garden classroom. Thank you everyone so much for being here, and feel free to say goodbye on your way out. And feel free to be in touch. Training at edibleschoolyard.org anytime is the best email to be in touch.